All right, let's jump into another deep dive. You sent over some really interesting stuff from a CBS News article all about January 2025, like how it was the hottest January ever recorded, which is, I mean, pretty wild considering it was a La Nina year, a time when things should have been cooler. So let's break this down together.
Yeah, it is pretty fascinating, isn't it? It's like, we're really seeing this kind of clash between climate change that's obviously driven by us,
Yes.
humans, and then the natural kind of climate variability that's always been there. And it's really important to understand both of those things, to really grasp what's going on.
For sure. And the article just kind of throws it out there right away, like record heat. But how hot are we talking? And why is this such a big deal?
So, uh, Copernicus, the European Climate Service, they reported that January 2025 was, let me check my notes, yes, 0.09 degrees Celsius warmer than the last record, which was actually set just last year, January 2024. And, that might seem like a tiny amount, but when you're talking about averages across the whole globe, it's actually pretty significant. It means that January 2025 was actually a full 1.75 degrees Celsius warmer than what things were like, before industrialization.
Wow. And I mean, that's getting really close to that 1.5 degrees Celsius warming limit that you always hear about, right? Does that mean we've actually crossed it?
Well, not quite. The article does mention that like 18 of the last 19 months have either hit or even gone over that 1.5-degree mark. But the thing is, scientists define that limit as, like a sustained global average over 20 years straight. So we're not officially there yet.
Okay. So we've got this super hot January, and it happened during a La Nina year, which I mean, it's kind of like, doesn't really make sense. So can you remind us how La Nina and El Nino work and why this is so unexpected?
Right. So La Nina and El Nino, they're basically like these natural climate patterns that happen in the Pacific Ocean, but they end up affecting the whole world. So
Hmm.
El Nino, that's when you get warmer than average water in the central and eastern Pacific, and that bumps up global temperatures for a bit. La Nina, on the other hand, brings cooler water to that same area, which typically brings global temperatures down.
So basically, La Nina should be counteracting global warming a bit,
Yeah.
right? But it doesn't seem to be doing that.
Exactly. La Nina's doing its thing, but what's happening is that other parts of the world's oceans are getting incredibly warm.
Hmm.
And this warmth, it's strong enough to cancel out what La Nina's trying to do, cool things down. And that's why we ended up with that record heat in January.
So even with La Nina trying to chill things out, we're still seeing this crazy heat. Makes you wonder if these natural climate variations can really keep up with everything. The CBS article also mentioned that things were unusually warm in the Arctic too. What's the significance of that?
Yeah, that's a really important point. The article talks about how parts of the Canadian Arctic were a whopping 54 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than average for January.
Mm.
And that kind of extreme warmth, it has major consequences, especially for sea ice, which is, really important for regulating the Earth's temperature.
Right, right. Melting ice and rising sea levels, that's a huge worry. And the article said that the Arctic sea ice levels for January, they actually tied the record low. I mean, that's a pretty clear sign that things are heating up, literally. So is it possible that that global warming is, speeding up faster than we thought?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And, well, scientists are actually debating this right now. The article mentions this new study by James Hansen. He's a pretty big name in climate science, and he's arguing that, yeah, global warming is accelerating. His research suggests that warming has basically doubled over the last 15 years compared to the 40 years before that. And one really interesting thing about his study is that it looks at the impact of, get this, reduced sulfur pollution from shipping regulations.
Wait, so less pollution is actually a bad thing?
Well, it's not that simple. See, sulfur particles in the atmosphere, they actually help reflect sunlight away from the Earth. So by cutting down on sulfur pollution, we might have accidentally reduced this cooling effect, which means more sunlight is reaching the Earth's surface, and that could be adding to the warming trend.
Wow. So even when we try to fix pollution, there can be unexpected consequences for the climate. So what are other scientists saying about this whole accelerating global warming thing? Do they all agree with Hansen?
Not really, no. The CBS article actually presents some counter arguments from other scientists too. Some of them think there's not enough data yet to say for sure that warming is accelerating, like Hansen's claiming. They say we need to look at a much longer period of time to really see those long-term trends.
So they're saying hold your horses before we jump to conclusions.
Yeah, pretty much. They're pointing out that climate, it changes naturally, and just because we see something happening over a short period, it doesn't always mean that's the big picture.
Makes sense. So what about those scientists who are saying that the temperature increases we're seeing are still basically what the models predicted? What's their argument?
Well, their point is that even though the rate of temperature increase is, definitely worrying, it's still falling within what those climate models have been projecting. They're not denying that things are serious, but they're saying we're not seeing anything that's, completely out of left field.
So it's like they're saying we've been sounding the alarm for ages and now it's happening just like we said it would.
Yeah, you could say that. They're basically saying that the current warming trend, while alarming, isn't totally unexpected.
So we've got all these different opinions from scientists, which makes it pretty tough to come to a solid conclusion. How should people, like us and our listeners who are trying to wrap their heads around all this, how should we make sense of these different viewpoints?
I think the main thing is to remember that science is, it's an ongoing process. Scientists are constantly exploring, questioning, testing, and, refining what we know. And sometimes we don't have all the answers right away.
Yeah.
It's totally normal for scientists to interpret data in different ways.
Okay, so zooming back in on January's crazy heat, what are the main takeaways for us and our listeners? Like what should we really be focusing on when we're trying to get a handle on all this climate change stuff?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the Earth's climate system is incredibly complex. It's influenced by so many things, some natural and some caused by humans. And what we're seeing now are the consequences of all that,
Yeah.
in real time. We've got those record-breaking temperatures, the ice melting, sea levels rising, and, well, a lot more.
And it's like, even when we're expecting nature to kind of step in and regulate things a bit, like with La Nina, the planet's still throwing us curveballs.
Absolutely. I mean, that record heat, even with La Nina happening, it kind of shows us that we can't just sit back and rely on those natural cycles to keep temperatures down. It really drives home the point that that humans are having a huge impact on the climate system.
So if La Nina can't even put the brakes on rising temperatures, what does that mean for what's coming next? Are we going to see like even more record-breaking temperatures, even in years when, in theory things should be cooler? And what does all this mean for those climate models, if stuff like this keeps happening?
Yeah, those are the really big questions, and scientists are definitely trying to figure those out right now. I mean, seeing those temperature extremes, even with La Nina in the mix, it suggests that there's a really powerful warming trend happening underneath it all. And if that continues, well, it could have some pretty major implications for how accurate those current climate models and predictions really are. This record-breaking January might be a sign that the impacts of climate change are actually accelerating faster than anyone initially thought.
So even when nature tries to like balance things out, the warming just keeps getting worse. That's a little scary. It makes you wonder about where climate change is headed and if what we're doing to try and slow it down is even working.
It's a valid concern for
Yeah.
sure. That unexpected warmth in January, despite La Nina, it really highlights how urgent this is. How urgent it is to address climate change. It's like a wake-up call to re-examine those climate models, maybe adjust the predictions, and really ramp up our efforts globally to try and minimize the damage.
You mentioned earlier that James Hansen thinks that reducing sulfur pollution from those shipping regulations could be contributing to global warming. It's like we're trying to solve one environmental problem and accidentally making another one worse.
Yeah, exactly. It just goes to show how interconnected all of Earth's systems really are and how complicated it is to try and fix environmental problems. Sometimes what you do to help in one area can have unintended consequences somewhere else.
So we can't just focus on one issue at a time, right? It sounds like we need a much bigger picture approach to solving these problems. We need to tackle the root causes and think about how everything is connected.
Yeah, exactly. We need to start thinking about systems.
Yeah.
Have to understand that Earth systems are all linked together, and the things we do can have a ripple effect.
Okay, so speaking of doing things, what can we actually do about all this? I mean, climate change feels like this massive problem that needs like a global solution. It's easy to feel like, well, what can one person even do?
You're right, collective action on a global scale is essential, but that doesn't mean individual actions don't matter. We can all make choices in our daily lives to reduce our own carbon footprint and contribute to a more sustainable future.
Can you give us some examples? Like, what kind of things can people do to make a difference?
Sure. We can think about how we get around, maybe take public transport more often, ride a bike, or walk when we can. We can also try to use less energy at home by, being mindful of how much electricity we're using and making our homes more energy efficient. And we can support those businesses and organizations that are, actively trying to be more sustainable. We can advocate for policies that support renewable energy and protect the environment, and just generally try to be more conscious consumers.
So it's a lot about making informed choices in our everyday lives and realizing that even small actions, when a lot of people do them, can add up to something bigger.
That's it. It's about realizing that we're all part of this bigger system, and our individual choices do make a difference. By making conscious decisions, we can collectively create positive change.
So it's about using our voices, our votes, and yeah, even how we spend our money to push for a more sustainable future. The CBS article also talked about those super warm temperatures in the Arctic, which is often called like the canary in the coal mine for climate change. Can you explain why the Arctic is warming up so much faster than other parts of the world and why we should care about it?
Yeah, so what you're talking about is called Arctic amplification, and it's a really crucial part of the whole climate change picture. The Arctic is actually warming up 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the planet, and that's because of a few things happening together, like the loss of sea ice and changes in how air circulates in the atmosphere.
That sounds pretty bad. Why is the Arctic warming up so much quicker, and what does that mean for everything else?
Well, one of the big things driving Arctic amplification is the loss of sea ice. It's kind of like, well, think of it this way. Ice is really reflective, right? So it bounces a lot of sunlight back into space, and that helps keep the planet cool. But as the ice melts, it exposes the darker ocean water underneath, and that water absorbs way more sunlight and heat. And that leads to, even more warming, which melts even more ice, and it just becomes this kind of vicious cycle.
So it's like this loop where less ice leads to more warming, which leads to even less ice?
Exactly. And it's not just the ice melting either. Changes in cloud cover and how the air circulates up there, that plays a role too.
Okay, but why should we be worried about what's going on in the Arctic? It seems so far away from, like most people's everyday lives.
The Arctic might seem really far away, but it's actually super important for keeping the global climate stable. When ice melts in the Arctic, it contributes to rising sea levels, which, that threatens coastal communities all over the world. It can also mess with ocean currents, and those currents have a big impact on weather patterns across the globe.
So what happens in the Arctic doesn't just stay in the Arctic. It really does affect everyone.
Exactly. The Arctic is like this vital part of the Earth's climate system. And those rapid changes we're seeing up there, they have some pretty big implications for all of us.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into January's record-breaking heat, it's pretty clear that that we're dealing with a really complex and interconnected challenge here. It's like natural climate variability and human-caused climate change are mixing together, and it's creating this very dynamic and, well, unpredictable system.
It's definitely a sobering reality. But, it's important to remember that we still have a say in what the future looks like. The choices we make today, both individually and collectively, those are the things that will determine the path of climate change.
So what can we do? What are some things we can do to, like, minimize the effects of climate change and try to create a more sustainable future?
Well, like we were talking about earlier, we can all try to make conscious choices in our daily lives to reduce our carbon footprint. Things like choosing more sustainable ways to get around, using less energy at home, and supporting businesses that are making an effort to be environmentally responsible.
Those individual actions are definitely important. But what about the bigger changes, the ones that need to happen on a, like, systemic level?
You're right. Tackling climate change requires us to think on multiple levels. We need to be pushing for policies that promote renewable energy, investing in research and development of new technologies, and really starting to transition away from fossil fuels.
And that takes a collective effort, right? It's got to be individuals, governments, and businesses all working together.
Exactly. Climate change is a global issue, and it needs a global response. We have to work together if we want to create a more sustainable and equitable future for everyone.
This deep dive has given us a lot to think about. Thanks for walking us through all of this. It's a really important and complex topic.
It was my pleasure. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep learning. We all have a part to play in building a more sustainable future.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another in-depth look at the sources you send our way. Until then, stay curious and stay hopeful.